A blinding winter storm buried the city in white as a Navy SEAL, and his silver-gray German Shepherd checked a remote rental cabin on the edge of town. It should have been routine, until his dog stopped, barking, clawing, begging him to open the door. Inside the frozen cabin sat a young bride in a broken wheelchair, abandoned and shaking, with nowhere to run and no heat to survive the night. Saving her meant taking responsibility he never wanted again. Walking away would have kept his life quiet and untouched. He chose to carry her into the storm. What he didn't know was this: the woman he rescued was hiding a secret far bigger than the blizzard outside, one that would shatter his trust, test his honor, and eventually change his life forever. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances speak to your heart, please subscribe for more. Duluth, Minnesota wore winter the way an old god wears armor, without apology. By noon, the sky was a hard pewter dome, and the wind that rolled off Lake Superior didn't merely bite. It scoured, sanding cheeks raw and turning every exposed breath into a small, white confession. Snow lay everywhere in a bright, unbroken sheet, and the frozen lake beyond the hill flashed like a blade whenever the clouds thinned, throwing cold light up into the city's windows. Even the pine trees seemed to stand straighter under the weight of it, as if they'd learned long ago that storms respected only those who didn't flinch. Jake Miller didn't flinch. He had learned that skill in places where the weather was human-made, where the wind came from rotor wash and the cold came from decisions. But Duluth had its own kind of warfare, quiet, bright, and relentless, and today it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to crack. Jake moved through the snow with the steady economy of a man trained to waste nothing, no motion, no words, no mercy on himself. He was 35, tall and broad through the shoulders, built like the kind of person who had carried heavy things for other people and never once complained about it. His face was weathered in a way that had less to do with age than with exposure. A square jaw that looked carved rather than grown, cheekbones that caught the lake light and made his expression seem harsher than it was, and a faint scar near his chin that disappeared under a short, disciplined beard. The beard was kept close, not a fashion statement, more like a concession to cold and habit. His eyes were the color of storm clouds over still water, gray with a quiet that didn't invite questions. People sometimes mistook that quiet for cruelty. It wasn't cruelty. It was damage, carefully packed away like a folded flag. There had been a time Jake laughed easily. Then life had taught him how expensive laughter could be, how it could tempt fate into looking your direction. These days he wore silence like his second uniform. And he did wear a uniform. His Navy working uniform, a green digital camouflage that blended strangely well with winter shadows and pine trunks. The whole outfit matching from top to bottom, no plain sections anywhere. On a civilian street, it looked out of place in the way a sword looks out of place at a dinner table. Still respectable, still useful, but a reminder that the person carrying it belonged to a different set of rules. The fabric was winter-ready, sleeves down, collar up. There was a flag patch, subdued enough to avoid shouting. Jake kept his hands gloved and his posture straight, the old discipline stitched into his spine. Beside him moved Ghost. Ghost was a 4-year-old German Shepherd with a coat that looked like it had been borrowed from moonlit stone. Silver gray threaded with white, rare enough that strangers sometimes did double takes as if they'd spotted a wolf that had chosen domestic life for a while. His build was athletic, powerful without being bulky, and his ears stood tall and alert, always listening to the world's secrets. His eyes were dark and intelligent, the kind of eyes that made people lower their voices without knowing why. Ghost had the calm of a seasoned partner, but not the softness of a pet. He walked close to Jake's left side with a precision that felt practiced, as if an invisible line connected them. They weren't just man and dog. They were a two-person unit, forged by nights when the only trust available was the kind you could put your hands on. 2 winters ago, Ghost had come from a rescue with paperwork that offered little and hinted at worse. Found wandering, unclaimed, signs of prior training. Jake didn't ask for details. Some histories were like landmines, better marked than stepped on. Ghost didn't bark much, didn't play much, didn't beg. He watched, he listened, he learned Jake's rhythms with unnerving speed, like he'd been waiting for a life that made sense. Jake, in turn, had learned how to breathe again with an animal at his side. Not happiness, Jake wasn't there yet, but function, purpose, a reason to keep the fire lit. The road up the hill toward the lake cabins was narrow and bright under packed snow. Jake drove his old truck slow, tires crunching over ice. The vehicle rattled a bit over rough patches, and the heater worked just hard enough to keep the windshield clear. He'd taken the job because it required no small talk. A neighbor he barely knew, Grace Mitchell, had called earlier with a request that sounded simple. Check on a vacant rental cabin she managed. Make sure it was locked down before the storm worsened. Grace lived on the outskirts of Duluth, a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and a stubborn way of helping people without asking permission. She was the sort of person who brought soup to your porch and pretended it was nothing. She didn't pry into Jake's past. She didn't treat him like a story. That restraint, strangely, felt like kindness. Jake owed her a quiet debt, and this check-in was how he paid it. He reached the cabin as noonlight bounced off the frozen lake, turning the world into an overexposed photograph, beautiful, brutal, and too bright to look at for long. The structure itself was an A-frame tucked among pines, its roof thick with snow, windows dark. No car in the drive, no footprints near the porch, at least none that survived the constant drift. Jake felt the familiar relief of a problem that might be solved with a quick turn of a lock. That's it, he murmured, more to Ghost than to himself. Ghost didn't move. His head lifted sharply, ears rigid. His body stiffened the way a compass needle snaps north. Then he let out a low sound, barely a growl, more like the engine of a warning starting. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd heard that sound before, not often. Ghost didn't waste alarms. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked. Ghost's gaze wasn't on the woods. It was on the cabin door. In a blink, Ghost exploded from the passenger side as soon as Jake popped the latch. Snow sprayed under his paws. He didn't circle. He didn't sniff the perimeter. He ran straight to the front steps, launched himself up, and began clawing at the door with frantic insistence. Not playful scratching, not curiosity, desperation. His nails scraped paint, a raw sound that cut through the wind. He barked, a deep, urgent bark that carried weight, as if the air itself should get out of the way. Jake froze for half a heartbeat. He didn't carry a weapon on this job. Minnesota wasn't a war zone, and he didn't want it to become one. But training doesn't leave you. It shifts, it adapts, it waits in your muscles like a coiled spring. Jake scanned left, right, tree line, window, roof line. Nothing obvious. Then he saw Ghost's posture. Front paws braced, shoulders flexing, head angled toward the seam of the door as though he could smell something leaking out from the crack. Echo? Jake started automatically, the wrong name from an older memory, and then corrected himself like biting down on a lie. Ghost. Back. Ghost didn't back. He whined, a thin sound threaded through his barking, and clawed harder. Jake climbed the steps and reached for the knob. The metal was so cold it burned even through gloves. He expected resistance. He expected the solid reassurance of a locked cabin. The knob turned, unlocked. That was the first wrong thing. Jake pushed the door open slowly, letting it swing inward a few inches. The air that poured out was a knife, dead cold, stale, and carrying something faintly sweet that didn't belong in a bare cabin. Expensive perfume. The kind worn in warm rooms with mirrors and soft music. Not here, not in a place that smelled of pine and old wood. "Hello?" Jake called, voice controlled. "This is Jake Miller. I'm here to check the property." No answer. Ghost slipped through the opening like smoke and headed straight into the main room. Jake followed, boots thudding softly on hardwood that felt too cold to be real. The cabin was dim but not dark, a gray light leaking in through curtains drawn halfway. No fire in the stone fireplace, no hum of electricity. The silence inside was heavy, as if the walls were holding on to the last breath of someone who shouldn't have been here. Then Jake saw her. She was tucked into the far corner near a small table, almost swallowed by shadow and a thin decorative throw that did nothing against the cold. A young woman, mid to late 20s, with blonde hair tangled and flattened as if she'd been crying into it for hours. Her skin was pale to the point of translucence, lips tinged blue. She sat in a modern, lightweight wheelchair, but the chair was broken. One wheel bent inward at a sick angle, spokes snapped, the frame twisted like it had been shoved hard. Her shoulders shook so violently the chair rattled. Ghost approached her slowly, the frantic barking gone in an instant, replaced by a low, questioning whine. He sniffed the air around her knees, then looked back at Jake, as if to say, "Here." This is it. This is why. Jake stepped closer, careful not to loom. His face softened by a fraction, the way stone softens when warmed by a hand. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low, "can you hear me? Are you hurt?" Her eyes lifted, wide, glassy, terrified. A fear so profound it looked like it had turned to ice behind her pupils. "Please," she rasped, Don't hurt me. I'm not going to hurt you." Jake crouched slightly to be at her level, palms open, empty. "My name is Jake. I'm checking this cabin." "What happened?" She swallowed, throat working. When she spoke, the words came out broken. He left me." A tear rolled and froze on her cheek. "My fiancé, Ryan." Her gaze flicked to the ruined wheel as if it were proof the world had turned against her. "We fought. He said I was worthless." Her voice cracked on the last word. "He pushed me. The chair, it broke. He took the car and..." She shivered hard enough to bite her own sentence in half. "He locked the heat. I couldn't... I thought I'd die." Jake's jaw tightened. Not anger yet. Anger was loud, and he had learned to keep it caged. What rose in him was something older, the instinct to move, to extract, to get someone alive to the next hour. He looked around quickly. No firewood stacked, no emergency kit visible, no generator hum. The pipes would freeze soon. The room temperature felt like it was already below safe. He shifted his attention back to her. "What's your name?" "Emily," she whispered. "Emily Carter." It was a common name, the kind you might see on a classroom roster or a holiday card. But here it sounded like a prayer. "Emily," Jake said, imprinting it, "we're not staying here." Her eyes widened. "I can't... my chair." "I see the chair." Jake's tone was firm but not unkind. "I'm going to carry you to my truck. My place is nearby. It's warm. You'll live through the night there. Do you understand?" She stared at him as if the idea of being helped was a language she didn't fully trust. Then she nodded, small and trembling. Ghost stayed close, positioning himself near her front wheel like a sentry. Jake slid one arm under Emily's knees and the other behind her back. She was shockingly light, either small by nature or depleted by cold and fear. He lifted her in one smooth motion, the way he'd lifted comrades under far worse circumstances, and the way he lifted her made it clear he wasn't asking permission from the storm. Emily gasped, fingers clutching the blanket. Ghost pressed in at Jake's side, matching pace. Jake turned to leave, and that's when he saw it. On the floorboards, cutting through a dusting of tracked snow, was a long smear. Not a footprint, a drag mark. Something heavy had been pulled across the cabin, from near the back hallway toward the corner where Emily now sat. The wood was scuffed raw, as if the cabin itself had tried to resist. Jake's gaze followed it. To the back of the cabin. The rear door wasn't wide open. It wasn't properly shut either. It rested in that sinister in-between position, almost closed, almost innocent, like a liar's smile. The expensive perfume lingered stronger in that direction, and beneath it, something sharper, cold metal and faint sweat, the scent of panic rubbed into wood. Ghost noticed Jake's pause and growled softly, eyes fixed on that back door. Jake's breathing slowed, the way it did when the world narrowed to a single corridor of choices. He adjusted his hold on Emily, shielding her with his body, and took one careful step toward the hallway. From somewhere deeper in the cabin, something creaked, wood settling, or a foot shifting, or a secret deciding whether to stay hidden. Jake didn't speak. He just stared at the half-closed back door, the drag mark at his feet, the perfume hanging in the freezing air like a warning from a different world. And behind him, Emily whispered, barely audible, "He said he'd come back." Jake didn't know if she meant Ryan or someone else. Jake didn't wait for the cabin to explain itself. He carried Emily out into the blizzard with the practiced urgency of a man who understood margins, the narrow line between survivable and fatal, between delay and regret. Snow lashed sideways, bright as powdered glass under the noon light, and the wind coming off Lake Superior cut through layers like a living thing. Emily's body trembled against his chest, light and rigid, the thin blanket already stiffening with ice. Ghost moved at Jake's left, a silver-gray streak against the white, ears pinned forward, head low, scanning the trees and the slope behind them. He did not bark. He did not look back. He walked as if the path were being laid down for him, one careful step at a time. Jake set Emily into the passenger seat of the truck, buckled her in with hands that did not shake, then climbed behind the wheel and brought the engine to life. The heater roared, the windshield cleared. Ghost vaulted into the back with a single smooth motion and planted himself so he could see Emily through the gap between seats. His dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was neither warmth nor threat, but judgment, the way a scale settles when weight is finally added. The drive back to Jake's cabin was short and treacherous, a ribbon of snow-packed road that wound through pines heavy with white. The sky hung low and luminous, an overexposed plate of light that turned every edge harsh. Jake kept the speed slow, both hands steady on the wheel, his mind stripping the situation down to essentials: heat, fluids, shelter, time. He did not think about the half-closed back door he'd left behind or the drag mark on the floorboards. He locked those images away where he kept things that would be useful later when panic was no longer required. Jake's cabin sat higher on the hill, built into rock and timber the way old forts were built into terrain, meant to endure rather than impress. It was a compact A-frame with a wide stone fireplace, thick beams darkened by age, and narrow windows that let in more light than view. He kicked the door open with his heel, the wind rushing in behind them like an animal trying to follow. Ghost scrambled inside first and shook snow from his coat, a sudden cloud of silver spray glittering in the light before settling onto the wood floor. Jake carried Emily to the couch opposite the hearth and laid her down gently, then turned to bar the door and slide the heavy bolt home. The cabin exhaled into quiet. "Stay," Jake said, not to Emily but to Ghost, who had taken 2 steps toward the door again as if the outside had unfinished business. Ghost obeyed, moving to a woven rug by the fire and lowering himself into a sphinx-like sprawl, head up, ears swiveling. His eyes never left Emily. Jake crossed to the fireplace, fed the embers with practiced hands, and coaxed the flame until it roared. The warmth rolled outward in visible waves, changing the sound of the room, the smell of the air. He filled a heavy mug with coffee, black and steaming, and brought it to Emily. Up close, she looked younger than he'd thought at the cabin, mid-20s, maybe. Her hair was a pale blonde that had once been carefully styled and was now matted at the temples, her skin porcelain pale with a faint flush beginning to return to her cheeks. She had a delicate bone structure that suggested a life spent indoors, but her hands were marked with faint calluses at the base of the fingers, as if she'd once gripped something hard and often and then stopped. Her eyes were a clear, startled blue, too alert for someone claiming to feel nothing below the waist. "Drink," Jake said, placing the mug between her hands. He didn't sit. He stood back, a shadow thrown long by the fire, his posture neutral and closed. "Thank you," Emily whispered. Her hands shook violently. The mug rattled against her teeth as she took a careful sip. The heat made her gasp, not in pain, but in shock, and Jake noticed it. The sharp inhale, the way her shoulders flinched, the way her breath stuttered as if something long dormant had been touched. He filed it away without comment. "I'm Jake," he said, keeping his voice level. "You said your name is Emily Carter. Is there anyone else with you? Anyone who might come looking?" She swallowed, eyes flicking to the door as if the idea itself had weight. "No. He left. He won't come back." The words were firm, rehearsed. Jake nodded once. He moved through the cabin, checking windows, securing shutters, setting 2 oil lamps on the table and lighting them when the overhead lights flickered and died. The generator coughed once and then fell silent. Jake didn't curse. He preferred the quiet anyway. When he returned, Emily was wrapped in one of the thick wool blankets he'd thrown over her legs. The blanket was old, oatmeal-colored, with a satin edge worn soft by years of use. "Your chair," she said, nodding toward the doorway. "It's useless in this," Jake cut in. "Snow's piling up fast. You're not going anywhere tonight." His tone wasn't cruel. It was factual, the way gravity is factual. Ghost shifted on the rug, nails clicking softly. He lifted his head higher, eyes narrowing as if recalibrating. Emily noticed him noticing. "Your dog," she said, attempting a small smile. "He doesn't seem to like me much." "He doesn't like a lot of things," Jake replied. "He's 4. Name's Ghost." As if summoned by the sound of his name, Ghost's ears twitched. He didn't wag his tail. He did not approach. He simply watched, his gaze steady and unblinking, as though measuring the space Emily occupied against some internal rulebook. Time settled into a strange shape. Outside, the wind hammered the cabin walls with a relentless insistence that felt personal. Inside, the fire cracked and the lamps cast amber light that softened edges without erasing them. Jake moved with Spartan routine, water on the stove, a thermometer pressed briefly to Emily's wrist, a quick glance at her lips and fingertips. He did not fuss. Emily noticed this too. Emily. There was no performance in his care, no soothing words, no attempt to earn gratitude. It unsettled her more than kindness would have. "Why do you live out here?" she asked quietly. Perhaps to fill the silence, perhaps because the silence was asking questions of its own. Jake didn't answer right away. He added a log to the fire and watched it catch. "Because it's quiet," he said finally. Emily nodded as if that explained more than it did. She stared into the flames, shoulders slowly lowering as warmth seeped into her bones. The trembling eased, then returned in smaller waves. When she shifted, adjusting the blanket, Jake saw it again, the subtle reaction, the reflexive tightening of muscle. He turned away before she could see him see it. Ghost rose without sound and crossed the room, stopping a few feet from the couch. He lowered his head, sniffed the air around Emily's knees, then lifted his gaze to her face. There was no hostility in him now, only inquiry. Emily held her breath, unsure whether to speak or stay still. Ghost took one more step and then stopped, as if an invisible line had been drawn. He sat, posture straight, tail still, eyes locked on hers. A judge, indeed. The lights flickered again and went out entirely, leaving only the lamps and the fire. The sudden absence of electric hum made the cabin feel smaller, closer to its bones. Jake straightened, senses sharpening. He glanced at the windows, the door, the rafters. Ghost's head snapped toward the front window, ears flaring wide. "What is it?" Emily whispered. Jake didn't answer. He moved to the window and parted the curtain an inch. Outside, the snow reflected the lamplight back at him in a blinding wash. For a moment, there was nothing, just white and wind. Then he heard it, a faint metallic sound, deliberate, almost careful. Metal brushing wood. Not the random scrape of a branch, not the clatter of ice. Something placed where it could be heard. Ghost growled, low and resonant, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He rose, every muscle tight, and fixed his gaze on the window. Jake let the curtain fall back into place. He didn't reach for a weapon. There wasn't one to reach for. Instead, he stepped between Emily and the glass, body angling without conscious thought, making himself a wall. Outside, the metal brushed the wood again, closer this time, and then it stopped. The storm did not pass so much as it settled in. A white occupation that erased roads and softened edges until time itself felt padded and slow. Daylight came bright and unforgiving. The snow outside the cabin reflecting so much light, it seemed to press inward through the narrow windows, bleaching the room into a quiet glare. At night, the oil lamps took over, their amber glow turning the cabin into a small, floating island of warmth surrounded by an endless, luminous dark. Jake and Emily were trapped not by locked doors but by accumulation, snow piling foot by foot, wind sealing the world shut with patient intent. Jake adapted to the rhythm without complaint. He split wood, fed the fire every few hours, checked the generator, and then abandoned it when it refused to cooperate, choosing silence over frustration. His movements were economical, deliberate, as if the storm were just another adversary to outlast. Emily watched him from the couch, wrapped in wool, her face regaining color in increments so small they were almost imaginary. She said little. When she did, her words sounded rehearsed, placed carefully as stepping stones across a river she didn't want to fall into. What she could not hide was her gaze. It kept returning to the 3 shallow steps that separated the living room from the kitchen and the front door. They were wide, old planks worn smooth by decades of boots and time, nothing to anyone else. To Emily, they might as well have been a cliff. She watched them the way prisoners watch windows, measuring, calculating, resenting. Jake noticed on the second morning, when the storm showed no sign of loosening its grip and the cabin felt suddenly smaller. He followed her eyes, said nothing, and filed the information away where he kept problems waiting for solutions. Jake's workshop sat just beyond the woodshed, a low structure built from salvaged timber and stubbornness. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust, oil, and cold iron. He pulled out a tape measure, a carpenter's pencil worn flat on one side, and a stack of rough plywood. He measured the height of each step twice, then again, writing the numbers on a scrap of wood. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who trusted tools more than people. There had been a time when he trusted people too. The time ended years ago, not with a single catastrophic event, but with an accumulation of losses that taught him to expect collapse the way farmers expect frost. He set the saw blade and began to cut. The sound was sharp and steady, a human rhythm pushing back against the storm's wordless roar. Emily heard it from inside and knew what it meant before she let herself believe it. She sat rigid on the couch, hands clenched in the blanket, guilt tightening in her chest like a knot pulled too far. When Jake returned 2 hours later, carrying a long and elegant ramp made of raw plywood and 2x4s, his beard dusted with sawdust, he did not announce himself. He fitted the ramp over the steps with careful precision. It locked into place as if it had always belonged there. "It'll hold," he said simply, stepping back. Emily stared. "You didn't have to. I had to do something," Jake replied, already turning away. "Can't just sit." He bent the warped wheel of her chair back into a serviceable shape with bare hands, metal protesting under controlled force. It wobbled, imperfect but functional. He helped her transfer with brisk efficiency, hands firm on her arms, lifting without hesitation or ceremony. The ramp creaked softly as he pushed her up. Outside, the cold slapped her face, clean and sharp, and the sight of the world, white, vast, painfully bright, made her inhale like someone surfacing after a long dive. Jake stood beside her on the porch, not touching, not speaking, simply sharing the space. Ghost sat at Jake's heel, breath pluming, eyes tracking the horizon. That was when Emily cracked, just a hairline fracture. "I'm trying to run from someone," she said, voice thin but steady. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Jake nodded once, accepting the truth without asking for proof. His acceptance unsettled her more than suspicion would have. The day wore on. The storm raged. Inside, the cabin returned to its contained routine. That night, the wind found new fury, battering the shutters with hands that wanted in. Sleep came in fragments. Jake woke to a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a soft movement, fabric shifting. He reached for the flashlight instead of the rifle, a choice made long ago and never revisited. The beam cut through the dim, skidded across the couch, and stopped. Emily was standing at the window, not leaning, not bracing, standing. She stretched one arm over her head, working a knot out of her shoulder with the absent ease of someone used to her body obeying her. The light froze there, and so did Jake. For a heartbeat, the world reduced itself to that single fact. Ghost lifted his head, confused by the sudden tension, then wagged once, hopeful and bright, as if the universe had just delivered good news. Emily turned, eyes wide, hand flying to her mouth. The lie collapsed without a sound, leaving only breath and the crackle of the dying fire. Jake did not move. He did not shout, did not demand an explanation, did not reach for anger the way most men would. He simply stood there in the dim cabin, the flashlight heavy in his hand, its beam cutting a pale tunnel through the dust and smoke of dying embers. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, but inside, the silence was worse, sharp, absolute, and cold enough to strip the air from his lungs. Years of training had taught him how to respond to threats, how to act when bullets moved faster than thought. Nothing had prepared him for this kind of impact, where the danger wasn't incoming fire but a single, undeniable fact standing barefoot in front of a window. Emily froze where she was, one hand braced lightly against the frame, the other hovering uselessly near her mouth as if she could push the moment back inside herself. Up close, standing revealed things she had carefully hidden before. She was taller than she'd seemed seated, slim but strong through the legs, calves defined in a way that didn't belong to someone who couldn't walk. Her posture, though tense, was instinctively balanced. She looked like someone used to occupying space, not someone resigned to being carried through it. Her blonde hair fell forward over her shoulders, catching the flashlight's glare, and her face, normally composed, practiced, had shattered into raw fear. "Jake," she whispered, her voice hoarse and unsteady. "I can explain." He did not answer. His expression did not change, but something fundamental behind his eyes went dark, as if a door had closed and locked itself from the inside. The silence pressed in on Emily, heavier than any accusation. She took a tentative step forward, then stopped, realizing too late that every movement only deepened the wound. Behind them, Ghost reacted before reason could catch up. The sudden shift in the room, the light, the tension, the human voices cracking, registered to him not as betrayal, but as revelation. His ears perked high, his tail lifted, and he let out a bright single bark that echoed off the beams. It was the sound a dog makes when a long problem suddenly solves itself. She's standing. She's okay. The world is better now. He bounded forward, nails clicking on wood, tail wagging hard enough to slap the side of the couch. The sound hit Jake like shrapnel. He flinched, not outwardly, but deep, where reflex lived. Of all the lies, of all the moments that had rearranged his understanding of the last few days, it was that bark that broke something final. Ghost circled Emily once in clumsy joy, sniffed her legs, and looked up at Jake with open, uncomplicated pride, as if waiting for praise. The dog had offered trust freely, innocently, and now that trust lay exposed, naive and unprotected, on the floor between them. "Ghost," Jake said at last. His voice was low, stripped of warmth, a command without anger. The dog slowed, confused. His tail kept moving, but less sure now, the wag losing its rhythm. He looked from Jake to Emily and back again, reading a room that suddenly spoke a language he didn't know. He retreated a step, then lay down near the hearth, head on his paws, eyes tracking every breath Emily took. Emily swallowed hard. "I wasn't going to lie forever," she said quickly, words tumbling over each other. I needed time. I needed to be safe." Jake turned off the flashlight. The click was final. Darkness reclaimed the cabin, broken only by the dull red glow of coals and the distant scream of wind. He walked past Emily without looking at her, boots heavy, shoulders rigid. He didn't touch her. He didn't acknowledge her presence. He sat in the old wooden chair near the door, back straight, hands resting on his knees as if he were standing watch over something already lost. No one slept. Morning came gray and brutal, the storm easing into a quieter menace. Snow lay piled high against the windows, transforming the outside world into a white wall with no horizon. Emily sat on the couch, knees drawn together, wrapped in the same wool blanket. She did not return to the wheelchair. There was no point anymore. Jake moved through the cabin as if she were furniture, fetching wood, stoking the fire, pouring himself coffee. His face was carved into something unreadable, his jaw set hard beneath the trimmed beard, the angles of his cheekbones sharper in the cold light. Whatever softness had briefly surfaced during the storm was gone, folded away like a map of a place he refused to revisit. After breakfast, if the silent consumption of oatmeal could be called that, Jake pulled on his jacket and gloves. He said nothing to Emily. He crossed to the steps and knelt, hands gripping the edge of the wooden ramp he had built. The structure was sturdy, well-made, still dusted with dried snow and sawdust. For a moment, his hands lingered there, fingers pressing into the grain as if remembering the hours he'd spent measuring and cutting in the workshop. Then he lifted it in one clean motion, carried it to the porch, and flung it into the snowbank beside the cabin. The ramp landed with a dull thud and disappeared halfway into the drift, an ugly plank swallowed by white. Emily stood without thinking. "Jake, please." He didn't turn. He didn't slow. He stepped back inside, closed the door with controlled force, and threw the bolt. The sound echoed like a verdict. Ghost rose and padded after him, stopping short when Jake raised a hand. Not a strike, not a threat, just a signal. "Stay." The dog obeyed, though his ears flattened and his eyes followed Emily with a confused ache. The hours crawled. The cabin felt smaller now, the brightness of the snow outside no longer cleansing, but exposing. Emily sat where she was, hands clenched, shame pressing down harder than fear ever had. She replayed every choice that had led her here, every calculation that had seemed clever at the time. None of them accounted for silence like this, the kind that did not seek resolution, only distance. Late in the afternoon, the sound came. At first it blended with the storm, a low, rhythmic thudding that vibrated through the air rather than cutting it. Jake stiffened instantly, head lifting. Ghost was on his feet in a heartbeat, hackles rising, gaze fixed on the narrow strip of sky visible through the front window. The sound grew louder, heavier, beating the air into submission. Emily's breath caught. She knew that sound. Jake stepped onto the porch and looked up. Against the pale, overcast sky, a black helicopter emerged from the clouds, its rotors churning the snow into a violent spiral. The machine looked obscene against the wilderness, sleek, deliberate, unmistakably purposeful. It hovered for a moment, dominating the white silence, and then angled toward the clearing near the cabin. Jake didn't move. He stood tall in his Navy working uniform, boots planted in the snow, Ghost at his side like a living shadow. Whatever was coming had found them. The helicopter did not land so much as impose itself on the clearing, its rotors beating the snow into a blinding cyclone that erased distance and drowned thought. The machine was matte black, clean-lined, purposeful, an object designed to move without asking permission. Jake watched it descend with the stillness of a man who had learned not to offer the sky any reaction it could exploit. Ghost stood at his side, shoulders squared, silver-gray fur bristling against the rotor wash, eyes narrowed into a hard, dark focus that never left the door as it slid open. A man stepped down as if the snow were a carpet laid for him. Ryan Hale moved with an ease that suggested money had always gone ahead of him, clearing obstacles before they could register as inconvenience. He was in his late 30s, tall and lean in an expensive way, his build more tailored than trained. His hair was dark and meticulously styled, not a strand out of place despite the wind. His face was sharply handsome, cheekbones clean, jaw smooth and unscarred, a faint smile set there like a permanent accessory. He wore a long navy cashmere coat over fitted slacks, leather shoes wholly unsuited to ice yet untouched by it, as if the ground itself understood who he was meant to be. His eyes were a polished hazel, bright with amusement and calculation in equal measure. People like Ryan didn't raise their voices, they raised eyebrows and expected the world to adjust. Behind him emerged a second figure, quieter and less adorned, Cole Ramirez, the pilot. Cole was mid-40s, compact and athletic, with a weathered face that suggested a life spent in cockpits and pressure. He wore a dark flight suit, mirrored aviators hiding his eyes, jaw set in professional neutrality. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He stood by the open door of the helicopter with the posture of a man who executed orders without needing to enjoy them. "Well," Ryan said, his voice carrying easily over the dying roar of blades as they wound down. "There you are." His gaze slid past Jake as if he were a fence post and settled on Emily. "Princess, you've made quite the scene." Emily's shoulders stiffened. She stood on the porch, barefoot on frozen wood, her face pale, but set. Standing revealed her fully now, tall enough to meet Ryan's eyes without tilting her head, slim through the waist, strong through the legs she had pretended not to have. Her blonde hair was tied back in a practical knot she hadn't worn before, her skin flushed raw by cold and emotion. She looked smaller next to Ryan's presence and yet more real, like someone who had stepped out of a costume and refused to put it back on. "How did you find me?" she asked, though the question sounded more like an accusation. Ryan laughed softly and tapped the side of his head with one gloved finger. "Emily, darling. The satellite phone." His smile widened, pleased with his own cleverness. "You didn't think it was just for emergencies, did you? There's a locator chip. Standard. My people insist." He gestured vaguely, as if my people were a natural extension of his body. "I'm disappointed you ran. We could have handled this quietly." Jake said nothing. He stood one step back from Emily, his presence solid and unyielding, a column of camouflage against the white. His face was carved from restraint, the angles of his jaw stark beneath the trimmed beard, eyes flat and watchful. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He simply existed in a way that made space refuse to compress around him. Ryan finally acknowledged Jake with a cursory glance. "And you must be the local color." His eyes flicked over the uniform, the boots, the scar near Jake's chin. "Noble, rustic, thank you for keeping her warm." The words dripped with courtesy, sharpened to a point. "Did she tell you her name, or did she prefer to be Jane Doe for the frontier experience?" Emily inhaled sharply. "Ryan, stop!" He ignored her and stepped forward, boots crunching on snow. His hand reached for Emily's arm with the casual entitlement of someone used to touching what belonged to him. He didn't make it halfway. Ghost moved. The dog placed himself squarely between Ryan and the porch, body low and broad, rough, standing out to make him look larger than he already was. His lips lifted just enough to show a flash of white. The sound that rolled out of his chest was deep, resonant, and unmistakably serious. A warning not issued lightly. It vibrated through the boards, through Ryan's shoes, through the thin veneer of his confidence. Ryan recoiled a step, surprise cracking his smile. "Call off your animal," he snapped, irritation bleeding through. Jake didn't move. He didn't speak. His eyes never left Ryan's face. Emily felt something shift inside her, a pivot she hadn't known she was capable of. She looked at Ryan, at the man who tracked her like cargo, who spoke of handling her life as if it were a transaction. And then she looked at Jake, the man she had deceived and who still stood there, unyielding, offering no comfort and no escape, only presence. Ghost growled again, a fraction louder. "Enough," Ryan said, impatience flaring. "We're leaving. Cole." Cole stepped forward and set a metal case down in the snow with careful hands. The case was compact, industrial, its surface dull and scuffed as if it had traveled more than it rested. He flipped the latches without comment. The lid opened with a controlled hiss. Inside lay equipment neatly fitted into foam, a compact firearm with a suppressor, a folded drone, and a small tablet glowing faintly. Tools, not weapons, at least not in the way Ryan liked to think of them. Emily's voice cut through the cold. "No." The word landed cleanly. Not loud, not hysterical, just firm. Ryan's head tilted, amusement returning in a thin line. "You think you have a choice?" Emily straightened, shoulders back, breath steadying. "I do." She didn't look at the case. She didn't look at Cole. She kept her eyes on Ryan. "You don't get to decide for me anymore." For a moment, the world held. The helicopter sat silent, the snow glittered under a weak sun, and the only sound was Ghost's low, unwavering growl. Ryan's smile hardened. He lifted one hand and made a small, precise gesture toward Cole, the kind that meant escalation without ever naming it. Jake shifted his weight, just enough to be felt. Not a threat. A fact. Emily stepped forward, placing herself half a pace closer to Jake's shoulder. It was a subtle alignment, but it was unmistakable. She had chosen a side. Ryan exhaled through his nose, irritation flashing hot. "Fine," he said lightly, as if indulging a child. "We'll do this the long way." Cole's fingers hovered over the tablet. The metal case lay open between them, a promise waiting to be kept. Emily did not raise her voice after Ryan's gesture. She did not plead. She waited until the rotors were fully silent and the cold reclaimed the clearing, then reached into the pocket of the borrowed jacket and pulled out the satellite phone. The device looked absurdly sleek against the raw wood and snow, a small black rectangle humming with power. Her hands were steady now. Whatever tremor had lived in her since the cabin had finally burned out. She turned away from Ryan without another word and typed, thumbs precise. The message was short, surgical. Pick up only. Do not bring Ryan Hale. Extraction as soon as weather allows. She hesitated, then added coordinates already blinking on the screen like an accusation. When she hit send, the phone vibrated once and went quiet. A promise sealed. Ryan watched her with narrowed eyes, the amusement gone. "You're making this difficult," he said. Emily didn't look at him. She looked at the snow beyond the porch, the line of trees standing patient and indifferent. "You don't own my exits anymore." Jake remained where he was, a silent boundary. Ghost stood planted at the step, ruff still lifted, the growl reduced to a low, constant thrum that spoke fluently in limits. Ryan took a step back, then another, anger sharpening into calculation. He nodded once to Cole, who closed the metal case with a soft click. The helicopter lifted minutes later, wind tearing at the clearing, and vanished into cloud without ceremony. The silence it left behind felt heavier than its presence. Emily went inside and moved through the cabin with a careful deliberateness, as if touching each surface mattered. She sat at the small table and found a scrap of paper beneath a worn book. The pen she used hesitated only once. She wrote without excuses. She wrote that her name was Emily Carter and that it was only part of the truth. She wrote that she was wealthy beyond comfort, that her life had become a series of transactions performed with smiles, and that she had staged the wheelchair not to deceive strangers, but to test a love that had already failed. She wrote that the test had taught her something she had not expected, that real care did not bargain, that it did not advertise itself, that it looked like a man measuring steps and cutting wood in a storm without asking for thanks. She wrote that Ghost had known before she did, and that his trust was the cleanest thing she had been given in years. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not explain further. She folded the letter, weighted it with a smooth river stone from the sill, and placed it where Jake would find it. The pickup came at dusk, a matte gray SUV that looked built for patience rather than speed. A woman stepped out first, Sarah Lorne, head of Emily's private security, early 40s, tall and spare with cropped auburn hair and skin weathered by real work. Her eyes were assessing but not unkind, the eyes of someone who had learned that control was quieter than threat. She nodded once to Emily, once to Jake, and said nothing else. Emily did not linger. She paused at the door, met Jake's gaze for a heartbeat that held apology and resolve in equal measure, then left. Ghost whined softly, confusion threading his posture. Jake did not move. The cabin emptied into a quiet that felt different than before, hollow, like a soundless room after music stops. Ghost paced once, twice, then lay by the hearth, head on paws, eyes following nothing. Jake fed the fire and read the letter once. He did not read it again. He folded it and placed it in a small metal box on the shelf, the kind meant for things that mattered too much to be handled often. 3 days later, the storm loosened its grip. Plows cut a narrow path through the road, and the sky returned to a pale, honest blue. Jake drove into town for supplies, Ghost riding in the back with a stiffness that mirrored his handlers. At the post office, among catalogs and notices, a heavy envelope waited. The bank's letterhead was crisp, the paper thick. Jake read the first line and felt heat bloom behind his eyes. Paid in full. The mortgage on the cabin, on the land that held his last living memory, had been satisfied by a payment from Collins Group Holdings. He drove home in silence, anger building like pressure behind a dam. In the cabin, he set the letter on the table and stared at it as if it might flinch. "She bought it," he said aloud, to no one. "She bought my pain." He paced. He clenched his hands until the scars along his knuckles whitened. Pride, the last thing he had guarded, felt violated. He imagined her signature sliding across a screen, imagined money erasing struggle as if it were chalk. Ghost watched from the rug, tail still, eyes worried. That night, after the fire settled and the lamps burned low, Jake stepped into the cold to clear his head. Moonlight turned the snow into a field of glass. He walked to the workshop and stopped. The door was ajar, not broken, opened. His breath slowed, body aligning to an older map. He followed the fresh prints leading away from the threshold, boot marks, not his, heading into the trees. He stood there a long moment, listening to the forest breathe, then turned back toward the cabin, every sense awake. Winter still ruled the hills above Duluth, but it had changed its voice. The storm fury was gone, replaced by a vast, blinding calm. Snow lay deep and reflective, turning the world into a white mirror under a pale sun that revealed everything and forgave nothing. The road leading to Jake's cabin had been plowed just enough to pass, its edges marked by dirty walls of ice like frozen scars. Jake stood near the fence line repairing a section crushed by snow load, his navy working uniform dark against the glare, shoulders moving with methodical strength. Ghost lingered nearby, no longer the solemn sentinel of weeks past, but not yet playful either. A silver-gray figure half resting, half watching, the red rubber ball tucked between his paws like a secret he refused to give up. The sound of an engine reached them, old, uneven, struggling up the grade. Ghost's head snapped up instantly, ears flaring wide. The ball rolled free and was forgotten. Jake straightened, one hand tightening around the hammer he carried more for balance than threat. The engine grew louder, gears grinding, until an aging blue pickup emerged from the tree line. Its paint was chipped, rust blooming along the wheel wells, the kind of truck that earned its miles instead of hiding them. It rolled to a stop a careful distance from the cabin and cut its engine. Silence rushed back in, thick and expectant. The driver's door opened slowly. A pair of worn boots touched the snow, followed by a woman who looked nothing like the Emily Carter who had left weeks ago in an armored SUV. This Emily wore faded jeans and a simple wool sweater the color of storm clouds. Her blonde hair was pulled into a practical ponytail, loose strands catching the light. Her face was bare, no makeup, no polish, skin flushed pink from the cold, eyes tired but clear. She stood tall, hands empty, shoulders squared in a way that suggested resolve rather than defense. She did not walk toward Jake. She stopped by the truck, leaving the distance intact as if it were a boundary she had no right to cross uninvited. Jake felt something shift, not relief, not anger, but a tightening awareness, the way the body recognizes a moment that will not be repeated. He took a step forward, then stopped himself. Ghost did not wait. "Emily," she said softly, testing the name in the open air. That was all it took. Ghost broke from Jake's side like a released spring. He ran hard across the snow, silver coat flashing, and collided with Emily's legs with a force born of weeks of confusion. He whined, crayed, and licked her face in a chaotic cascade of sound and motion, tail a blur. Emily laughed and cried at once, dropping to her knees without hesitation, arms wrapping around his neck as he pressed his weight into her like proof of life. She buried her face in his fur and whispered his name over and over, as if it were an apology that could finally be heard. Jake watched, hammer slipping from his grip to land softly in the snow. The sight hit him with a complexity he hadn't prepared for. Ghost pulled back suddenly, remembered something, and dashed a few feet away to retrieve the red rubber ball. He returned and placed it carefully in Emily's hands, nudging it forward with his nose. His eyes were bright now, earnest. "This is how we start again." Emily stood slowly, clutching the ball as if it were ceremonial. She met Jake's gaze at last. "I paid the bank," she said, voice steady despite the tremor underneath. "Not you. I didn't give you anything. I took something away from them." She gestured toward the cabin, the land, the quiet. They were going to take this. "I couldn't let that happen. Not after everything." Jake's jaw flexed. Pride rose on instinct, sharp and ready, but it faltered when it found no purchase in her face. There was no triumph there, no expectation, only a weary honesty that looked almost like fear. "I didn't come back for forgiveness," Emily continued. "I came back because leaving without saying this felt like another lie. You don't owe me anything. I know you won't take money. I just needed you to know why." Before Jake could answer, a sound snapped through the quiet, a branch breaking somewhere in the woods, deliberate and close. Ghost's posture changed instantly, fur lifting along his spine, growl building low and serious. Jake turned toward the trees, every muscle aligning to threat. "Found her!" a man's voice called out from the timber. The words were calm, professional, and entirely unwelcome. The forest answered the voice before the people did. Branches parted with a dry crackle and two figures stepped into the clearing, boots crunching over crusted snow that glittered under the high winter sun. The first was Grace Mitchell, the woman who managed the rental cabins up the hill, early 60s, and built like someone who had hauled wood her whole life. Short, sturdy, gray hair pulled back beneath a knit cap, cheeks permanently pink from weather and laughter. Her eyes were kind but sharp, the sort that noticed locks left loose and lies told too easily. At her side stood Officer Ben Holloway of the Duluth Police Department, mid-40s, tall and broad through the chest, a thick brown mustache warming a face etched by years of cold calls and harder conversations. He wore his winter uniform with quiet authority, posture open rather than aggressive, palms visible, his gaze moving calmly from Jake to Emily to Ghost. "Easy," Holloway said, voice level. "We're not here to cause trouble." He nodded toward the cabin and then toward the trees. "We got a report tied to that helicopter in a metal case. Turns out it's not just rich boy theatrics." Grace exhaled, relief tugging at her shoulders. "I heard engines and thought the worst," she said, then looked at Jake. "You okay?" Jake nodded once. Ghost's growl eased into a watchful rumble and then fell silent. The dog read Holloway's posture the way he read weather, tail lowering as threat dissolved into procedure. Holloway explained without flourish. The metal case opened by Ryan Hale's pilot contained equipment linked to a blackmail operation. Coercive tracking, recorded leverage, intimidation dressed as protection. A judge had signed off on warrants that morning after a whistleblower tied Ryan's invisible collar tactics to multiple victims. The helicopter had fled, but the net was closing. Ryan was no longer a man arriving from the sky. He was a man running out of it. Emily listened, hands steady at her sides, face pale but resolute. When Holloway finished, she nodded. "I'll sign," she said, "whatever you need." She understood the cost. Signing meant cameras, questions, headlines that would try to turn her into a parable or a punchline. She accepted it without bargaining. Grace squeezed her arm once, approval warm and brief. Inside the cabin, sunlight poured through the narrow windows, the snow outside throwing it back so brightly the room seemed rinsed clean. Emily read the statement carefully, then signed her name with a pen that felt heavier than it should have. Holloway thanked her, respectful and concise, and promised to be in touch. Grace lingered long enough to check the back door latch, mutter about drifts, and leave a loaf of bread on the counter like punctuation at the end of a sentence. When the door closed, the quiet returned. But it was different now. Not hollow, open. Jake stood by the hearth, arms folded, eyes on the fire. The letter Emily had left days ago waited in its metal box on the shelf. He hadn't opened it again. He didn't need to. He had learned the hard way that truth wasn't a thing you dissected until it behaved. It was something you allowed to stand. Emily didn't rush him. She stepped to the window and watched the light play across the drifts, the way the snow held the world still without suffocating it. Ghost nosed the red rubber ball at her boots and then carried it back to Jake, placing it carefully against his shin. The gesture was patient, insistent, gentle. This is how we speak now. Jake crouched and picked up the ball. It was scuffed and ugly and indestructible, heavy with slobber and meaning. He felt the last knot inside him loosen, not forgiveness bestowed by argument, not absolution earned by proof, but permission granted by the only judge who mattered to him anymore. Ghost had chosen to trust again. Jake followed suit. "I don't forget," Jake said quietly. He met Emily's eyes, the gray there softer now, like a sky after snow. "But I can live without walls." Emily nodded, tears bright and unhidden. "That's all I'm asking." Morning came clear and astonishingly bright. Jake stepped onto the porch in his Navy working uniform, boots planted on boards warmed by sun, and threw the red ball across the clearing. Ghost launched after it, a silver streak against white, catching it mid-bounce and skidding to a stop, tail high. Emily laughed, an unguarded sound that rang true, and the sound settled into the land like a promise kept. They did not speak of forever. They spoke of now, and now was enough. In a world as cold and blinding as winter snow, miracles rarely arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come softly, on four paws, through a door left unlocked or in the courage to tell the truth when lying would be easier. This story reminds us that God's work is often hidden in ordinary moments. In a man who chooses honor over bitterness, in a woman who chooses truth over fear, and in a loyal dog whose heart recognizes goodness before the mind can remember it. Faith is not always about grand signs. Sometimes it is about trust. Trust that doing the right thing still matters, trust that broken lives can be rebuilt, and trust that no storm lasts forever. In our daily lives, we may not face blizzards or helicopters, but we all face moments where we must choose between control and surrender, pride and humility, walls and love. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder that God can use even pain to guide us home. Share this message with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. And if stories of faith, loyalty, and second chances speak to you, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing them. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and guide you through every storm until the light returns and the path becomes clear again.